Do you think that democracies are actually have oligarchies contained within them? And is this, as Bonnie would argue here, a result of having an hereditary head of state?
I think the answer is if you go back to traditional small-scale societies, which are nominally completely egalitarian, they never are completely egalitarian because...
Would it be good if they were?
I'm sure it would be good if they were, but I think you're always struggling against the eternal conflict between one's own selfish interests on the one hand and what is in the wider interests of the community on the other. As you know, we are primates. We share a lot of our evolutionary history with primates. We share a lot of our sort of, if you like, our social background in particular. The key to primate evolutionary success has been essentially the invention of implicit social contracts to, collectively solve the problems of life and survival and so on, communally. And those sort of communal solutions, any kind of explicit or implicit social contract, forces you to compromise on your personal ideals because you've got to give everybody else some space, otherwise they're just going to walk out of it. And in primate societies, they have that option. If the stresses become too great, they just split and go somewhere else. In general, humans are less able to do that. But what you're sort of, it seems to me, you have constantly under the groundswell of all this is this constant tension between what's in the individual's interest and what the individual can grab for him or herself. Hence the origins of monarchy and sort of big man societies and feudal systems and all the rest of it. And on the other side, the fact that actually if we destroy the social contract, we're actually done for. So there's this kind of tension between these two components, and you have to hold them in balance somehow. We'll never get rid of selfishness. People will always grasp. And that's the problem in the end, that kind of David was alluding to, with oligarchies. In the end, most of them aren't enlightened, because once you've got enough, I don't know, does the Queen hang on desperately to her ill-gotten gains from the last 10 centuries and or whatever it is, or not, I don't know. But, sort of the great problem certainly with autocrats is once you've got power, you're very reluctant to relinquish it, and you somehow wonder how on earth we managed to persuade in the West monarchies to give up some of that centralized power and become constitutional monarchies, because that's sort of somewhat...
Well, nevertheless, we did.
But we did. Yes.
And Bonnie, do you think that were there to be, imagine a referendum in this country on the monarchy, imagine the monarchy lost, can you see the monarchy then continuing? Surely that's...
If the monarchy lost the referendum, if it wouldn't it be a statement that the people wouldn't want the monarchy?
Exactly. Under your thesis, the monarchy would pay no attention. If we don't live in a democracy, the democratic will would have no impact.
Well, what Simon is saying is absolutely right. We don't live in a monarchy in that sense, of course. She can't ride in with a bunch of horses and make us do anything, which is why I'm saying what's so unique...
But she's got the horses.
Oh, it certainly does. What's so incredible about British democracy, because you've actually held this family and its customs, you've held it in check constantly. It's quite a brilliant sort of balance of this thing called British democracy. But I still say that it's in existence, and I have curtsied in front of the Queen, and will always do that, give her respect, and Charles and everyone else. So it's not about them personally. Just as a question, it's an interesting thing to me, being American born, that you can see this institution of monarchy replicated through the institutions of our country in many, many ways. That's what interests me more than this family at the head. It is what it replicates, what the oligarchy keeps back. That is the shadow of this monarchy, and that is what's interesting to me.
David, I'd like to hear your view on that, and whether we're really living an illusion and that we are just not perceiving the state as it really is.
No, the reason why we continue to be a monarchy is because it doesn't matter, not because it does. And and that is essentially the reason. The Queen has absolutely no power. And we're prepared. I mean, actually, I wouldn't curtsy to the Queen. I really don't give a damn one way or the other. But it is something that people quite enjoy, they quite like, and it means that we don't have to go to the business of electing a powerless president instead.
Interesting,
which,
the business.
Yeah. I mean, we have... And actually, when you said, Bonnie, that people in Britain don't understand the British Constitution, actually, on the whole, people do understand that they vote for MPs in constituencies, and that the MPs from the party that make up the majority will tend to be the MPs who then form a Prime Minister. And that is actually how our system
works. But what's
works.
Scary to me is when people, and I'm surprised that you said it, because it's scary to me when people say we don't have to go through the business, we don't have to be bothered, we don't have to go through this, we don't have to. Well, that's democracy, isn't it, to go through it?
No, the democratic bit comes when we have general elections, and you've noticed those. Right, we have them every 4 to 5 years. We have a big palaver about them. We try and get people to vote in them, and I think people understand that that's when the transfer of power happens. The rest of it is, to a certain extent, soap opera. Now, there could be a moment when actually a monarch is regarded as being unpopular. You won't have a referendum when it happens. You will know when it happens, because people will moan like hell about it, and the newspapers will be full of it, and there will be some kind of mood about it. There was something of that happening in 1997 before it settled down. There was actually a moment of disillusion with the monarchy for a variety of reasons. So it's not actually the case that only the formal mechanisms of democracy are what grant you change within a democracy. And actually the voting bit of a democracy, and this is where Simon's absolutely right, is only a small part of the system that we call democratic. I just like to point out John Keene's fantastic book called The Life and Death of Democracy, where what he says is that we have actually evolved a great distance even from representative democracy since 1945. We have set in place in a whole series of countries what he describes as monitory democracy. In other words, all these other bodies, such as judges, such as the press, but also all these other bodies, Amnesty International, it could be a large number of other organisations as well, represent forms of checks and balances upon the powers of those even who are elected. And that is actually a very sophisticated... So one of the reasons why you ask yourself, why do we have so many quangos? There's always a battle against the quangos by politicians, is because quangos represent a distancing of decision-making from politicians, partially because we increasingly demand it.
I just want to put in a definition and then return to this idea of the representative character of democracies that we live in. The definitions of these, let's go back a moment. Monarchy is a situation where you have rule by the one, by the sovereign. Oligarchy is the situation where you have rule by the few. And democracy, supposedly, is the situation where you have rule by everyone, by all. Now, that idea of rule by all is almost an inconceivable idea in terms of actually getting anything done. So what happens in democracies from the beginning is that you have some structures of representativity. Aristotle, when he first thought about this, found it very odd, but he thought that perhaps what you could do is take it in turns. And there was an idea that everyone, as it were, obviously he was thinking of a city-state rather than a nation-state, but everyone would, as it were, take turns in being the leader, and it would go round in cycles like this. You'd have a sort of wheel. Well, in a modern representative democracy, that idea of the wheel, of the taking turns, is conducted through elections, and the possibility of changes in political power, and that possibility has to be something which is never interrupted. Now, representativity, however, does mean that democracy is at every moment exposed to oligarchy, because representativity is always a few. There's the few who will at any time be doing the job. So, yes, democracy will always be exposed to the threat of being ruled by the few, but if you have structures of representativity through electoral systems where each person counts one, and that's the crucial moment of the all, is that each one of us counts the same, then you have this possibility of change, which I think gives an inflection to what would otherwise appear as an oligarchical regime, as some totally different character, and the manifest nature of that difference comes out in the fact that there is the possibility of critique. of always being open to change, open to the revisability of institutions. Just one more thing on this, which perhaps again picks up on something that David mentioned of democracy beyond representativity within our politics. One area that I think is particularly impressive in our time today, I mean, that compared to only 70 years ago, is the extent to which a roughly speaking capitalist system, although it's obviously not just completely capitalist, there's lots of regulations and there's a state and so on, but within the capitalist system that we live in, it has encouraged and certainly produced forms of communication that make it possible for ideas to irrigate the entire social fabric in a way that was extremely difficult and actually available only to a very few in the past. So now, through things like the blogs that I've read out, or indeed through this kind of event here, people are able to disseminate opinions which may be completely against the views of a ruling elite at any time. And it may be that events like this don't have, as it were, a direct route, but nevertheless there are sort of capillaries within our social system, which means that more than ever before, I mean, in an astonishing way, more than ever before, ideas irrigate the social field in a way that it makes changes of ways of thinking and patterns of possibility open to us that we've never had.
I'm conscious in this discussion that we're talking about the nation state as though it were in itself an autonomous unit, which I think we probably wouldn't defend as a proposition. I just wonder if we could pull back a little from the perhaps fustian character of the British state and look at the degree to which international elites constitute oligarchs that actually impede the functioning of our democracy. You know, we quite surprising there hasn't been a mention of the enormous power of international capital, or the power of the markets to inhibit democratic decisions and democratic will. You know, are we in a fundamentally different situation now?
I don't. Well, we are. We're in a continuously evolving situation, and we are in a world which has a degree of connectivity and rapidity and mobility, which of course it has never seen before, and it becomes increasingly mobile. Now, this throws up and has thrown up over time all kinds of challenges. One of the great problems for capitalist democracy at the end of the 19th century was that it had no forms for control of the possible depredations of people who had actually effectively no social conscience and no long-term view about how society would be affected. Now, at that point, in America as elsewhere, there were all kinds of bits of legislation brought through in order to curb the power, the whole business of monopolies legislation and so on. We now have a rules-based system internationally. You can say it's inadequate, and as Simon rightly points out, saying things are inadequate is an essential part of being able to change them. That's the whole point. Sometimes I look at people who are having a really big moan about what kind of country they are, and I say it's absolutely terrible. The police, they're like fascists. And part of me wants to say, what are you talking about? Have you actually ever seen any bloody fascists, etc.? I mean, are you ridiculous? But the other part of me thinks, maybe it's precisely because they keep on about the police being like fascists that the police don't get to be like fascists, if you see what I mean. In other words, this kind of dialogue is absolutely continuous. So we're in the business continuously of monitoring and improving. Now, sometimes we do this well, and sometimes we do this incredibly badly. We do have a relatively good set of rules-based rules for international trade and so on, but we do have people and circumstances that violate it, and we do have real difficulties. Coming back to Robin's original point, even if I don't necessarily accept the thesis for which he is duly famous, which is that the 150 recognised faces notion and the notion of what human society constitutes, it is certainly true that there are significant limitations on the capacity of one person to keep all the information in mind which are required to administer things.
I'm interested as well in what you were saying about you mentioned markets in relation to oligarchy, and we know that a lot of the present government's austerity program is directly talking to the markets, the currency markets. It's very important that this country keeps its AAA rating, its S&P rating, all of these things, in order for it to be able to borrow money. So that, in fact, our impact on this particular policy is close to nil, if not nil, because they're playing to that particular oligarchy, which is the markets.
And of course, the Greeks, who like to think they invented democracy, are in a